Prague, 1618. It's morning on a pleasant summer's day when the tranquility of the old city is torn apart by a mob crossing the Charles Bridge and storming into the courtyard of Hradčany Castle. Led by Protestant nobility, they're there to punish the officials they hold responsible for infringing their rights and insulting their religion. Less than an hour later, 3 men will have been thrown 70 feet to near certain death, thus starting one of the most brutal and long-lasting wars in European history. Rouen 1203, Brussels 1378, Lisbon 1383, Prague 1419, Stirling 1452, Florence 1478, Prague 1483, Paris 1572. Throwing people from windows has a long and storied history in Europe, but there is one incidence of such mob violence that far exceeds all of the others in both its notoriety and its far-reaching consequences. The Defenestration of Prague in 1618 sparked a rebellion against the ruling Habsburg dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire, the huge, multinational collection of city-states and kingdoms that spanned Central Europe. And because the Habsburgs were then also in control of both a European and global empire stretching from Spain and Portugal to South America and on to the Philippines, China, and India, the Bohemian Revolt eventually drew all of the major European powers into a contest for continental supremacy that did not end for 3 decades and had a major influence on global history. The word defenestration descends from Latin, wherein the word fenestra translates as window, and the prefix "d" means down from. To defenestrate literally means then to throw someone down from a window. In its consequences and historical impact, the Defenestration of Prague is comparable to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, a dramatic but seemingly local event in a regional dispute, the like of which happens somewhere almost every day, but one which went on to affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Before we learn how and why throwing 3 imperial officials from the window of a castle in Prague sparked a European war so damaging that it led to a radical rewriting of international law, if you're interested in early access to videos and live chats with the creator of Intrigued Mind, consider subscribing to our Patreon. Your support will greatly help us keep the channel producing more intriguing content. At the outset of the 17th century, the twin branches of the Habsburg monarchy were still the primary power in Europe. In the 15th century, the main religious tension within the Habsburg realms came from Spain following the conquest of the last Islamic kingdoms at Granada in 1492 and the status of the country's Jewish population. However, in the early 16th century, after Martin Luther posted his theses and started the Protestant Reformation, religious conflict spread to the Holy Roman Empire also. The advent of the Protestant movement created instability and violent conflict even in the centralized states of England and France. But in the German-centered Holy Roman Empire, where more than 1,000 states had some form of sovereignty under the overlordship of the Habsburgs, there was what historian John Pike calls a toxic and volatile mix of religious, political, and constitutional stresses. This volatile mix applied particularly to the Kingdom of Bohemia, which had come under Habsburg rule in 1526. Bohemia presented a problem to the Habsburg notion of a Catholic universal monarch. Bohemian monarchs were elected, a direct contradiction of the Habsburg doctrine of the divine right of kings, and its independent religious atmosphere was such that it had already undergone a reformation of sorts a century prior to Martin Luther's protest at Wittenberg. In fact, the first Defenestration of Prague had taken place in 1419, when a mob had thrown royal officials from Prague's new town hall after a religious procession turned violent. Another defenestration took place there in 1489, when Prague was under the rule of the Hungarian monarchy and the town's burgomaster, or chief magistrate, was thrown from the windows of the new town hall. Both of these incidents resulted in the deaths of the victims. Martin Luther's Protestant movement found a ready audience in the Czech Bohemian lands then, and by the early decades of the 17th century, as many as 90% of Czechs followed a non-Catholic religion. Though the Catholic Habsburgs adopted a pragmatically moderate approach and allowed their Czech subjects a large degree of religious freedom during this period, it was instability within the royal family that eventually led to the infamous events of 1618 and the subsequent catastrophe. It began when the Archduke of Austria, Matthias, challenged the capability of his elder brother, Rudolf II, to rule as Holy Roman Emperor. Rudolf had held the throne since 1576, but by the early 1600s, his debilitative condition, which was described at the time as melancholy, but was likely some form of severe depression or other mental illness, along with a seemingly endless, inconclusive war with the Ottoman Turks, had created a wide base of support for Matthias to take control of the throne and rescue the stagnant empire. To keep the support of the Bohemians, Rudolf wrote what is commonly called the Letter of Majesty, in which he promised that Protestants could practice their religion without let or hindrance from any person. Despite Rudolf's efforts, Matthias steadily increased his power, and the Bohemian nobles remained unsatisfied, even though they maintained the Letter of Majesty as an unequivocal foundation of their religious rights. By the time of Rudolf's death in 1612, he had lost any remaining power to Matthias, who was elected and crowned Holy Roman Emperor in June. The relatively calm situation was not to last, for Matthias had no legitimate heir with his queen, Anna of Tyrol, who also persuaded her husband to relocate the imperial capital from Prague to Vienna in 1616. With no sons to whom he could pass the crown, Matthias chose his nephew, Ferdinand of Styria, as his heir. It was a fateful decision. Through his devoutly Catholic mother, Ferdinand had been schooled in the Jesuit tradition, the ultra-Orthodox order of Catholic priests founded specifically to reverse the growing Protestant movement, and he fully intended to implement their ideas once he held power within the royal family. Aware of Ferdinand's Catholic convictions, but compelled to ensure his royal line, Matthias adopted Ferdinand as his son in 1615 and then had him elected as King of Bohemia and Hungary 2 years later. Ferdinand's reorganization of religious policy began almost immediately, and the now sick Emperor Matthias was not in a position to hold him in check. Ferdinand had been made to swear he would not interfere with the pre-existing settlements, but once King of Bohemia, he argued that the promises in Rudolf's letter applied only to non-royal lands, and he ordered that the practice of Protestant worship and construction of Protestant churches on royal lands were to cease immediately. Already jittery, the Protestant Bohemian nobility erupted in protest at this infringement of their rights. They met in March of 1618 to discuss a response to Ferdinand's ruling, and the Emperor Matthias had this assembly broken up with the threat of execution for any who attended such unofficial conferences. Nevertheless, the Bohemians arranged for another assembly to take place in Prague that May, starting on the 21st. 2 days after this assembly's opening, events spilled into outright violence, led by Heinrich Matthias, a different Matthias, Count Thurn, a group of Protestant representatives and their household guards, accompanied by a large crowd of supporters, crossed the Charles Bridge and made their way to Hradčany Castle, where the royal representatives had their offices. These were Count Jaroslav Martinitz, Count Wilhelm Slavata, Matthew Lobkowitz, and Adam von Sternberg. Philip Fabricus, a clerk, was also present. Thurn and his Protestant associates made their way into the council chamber of the castle and confronted the now alarmed officials. They read a portion of the Emperor Matthias's letter to the Bohemian Assembly and made statements to the effect that as their lives were now forfeit, they had made the decision to stand together to resist oppression. Then, more ominously, they stated that the emperor could only have made such a declaration at the behest of what they called their religious enemies, and demanded to know whether any of the royal officials present had a hand in that conspiracy. Martinitz and the others tried to delay the mob by asking to contact their emperor for orders, but unbeknownst to them, their fate had already been decided. Thurn and the others were simply going through a charade. Enraged, Thurn threw Martinitz to the floor, and a man named Litwan van Ricken distributed a number of pistols he had hidden under his cloak. Lobkowitz and Sternberg were told that they were not held responsible and were expelled from the room. One of the Protestant leaders declared, "It is clear that the imperial letter goes against our letter of majesty. You are enemies of us and our religion." Martinitz recounts that he was pinned by several men and then lifted towards the open window, one of them pronouncing that they would have their just revenge. Shouting prayers and appeals to God and the Virgin Mary, Martinitz was thrown through the window, 70 feet to the ground below. Thurn then pointed at Slavata and said, "My worthy lords, there is the other one." Slavata was duly forced to the window, where he made the sign of the cross and said, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." Slavata was then thrown from the window after Martinitz. He managed to hold onto the windowsill for a moment, but one of the attackers brought the handle of a dagger down onto his fingers, and he fell awkwardly, striking his head on the lowest windowsill before landing on the ground. The conspirators then threw the secretary, Fabricus, from the window also. Incredibly, all 3 men survived the fall. In his account of the ordeal, Slavata attributes this to the intercession of the Virgin Mary and heavenly angels, who guided them safely to the ground. The Protestant side argued that it was in fact a large rubbish and refuse heap built up against the wall of the castle that cushioned their landing. In any event, Fabricus was able-bodied enough to rise immediately and make his escape, catching a carriage to Vienna to report the attack to the emperor that evening. Slavata was knocked unconscious, but Martinitz came to his aid. reviving him before the mob could shoot them from the window, or Thurn's guards could rush down the steps from the castle to finish the job. The two men were forced to go into hiding and make their way to safety some days later. Remarkably, Martinitz's only injuries came from his own sword, when he rolled over the ground to help Slavata and avoid the gunshots of the mob from the window. By the time of the Emperor Matthias's death a few months later, Bohemia was in open revolt and had appointed a replacement monarch, Frederick, who became known as the Winter King when the Habsburg forces counterattacked and deposed him after only 3 months. Though short-lived in its early stage, the Bohemian Revolt inspired other uprisings through the Habsburg domains, and these continued as, one by one, the great powers of Europe entered the conflict over the next 3 decades, now known as the 30 Years' War. Even the Peace of Westphalia, which ended major operations in the Holy Roman Empire, did not bring about a general European peace, as Spain and France remained at war until 1659, and the now independent Portugal's war with the Dutch Republic did not end until 1663, almost half a century after the 3 local officials had miraculously survived being thrown from a window in Prague. For more videos on the most amazing forgotten parts of our history, be sure to subscribe to the Intrigued Mind channel. Like the video and leave your suggestions in the comments below.